It is July of 1945 in Washington. In the offices of the United States Office of Naval Intelligence, an analyst updates the file on the largest warship the Japanese Empire ever put to sea. Under the line for her main guns, the file gives a figure, 16 inches. It is a careful number drawn from years of watching from a distance, and it is wrong. The guns on that ship measured 18.1 inches across. They were the largest naval guns ever mounted on any vessel in history, and the men who built them had spent years making certain that no one on the outside would ever learn their true size. The file is wrong by more than 2 inches. It is also 4 months too late. The ship it describes, the battleship Yamato, is already gone, torn apart by American aircraft and sunk in the East China Sea that April, taking most of her crew of roughly 3,000 down with her. Consider what that means. The mightiest battleship ever built was concealed so completely that her enemy still had her most basic measurement wrong after she was already lying on the seabed. That was not luck. It was the result of a deliberate industrial operation that ran for 4 years, behind a roof, behind walls, behind curtains of rope that weighed hundreds of tons, in a dock that had to be rebuilt just to hold her. The machines that built the Yamato and the machinery that hid her were never two separate projects. They were one and the same. Over the next half hour, we are going to follow that operation from an empty dock upward. The crane that had to be made stronger, the guns written down under a false number, the ship built for the single purpose of carrying those guns, the launch that no one was permitted to watch, and the thousands of men who assembled the biggest warship on Earth while forbidden to speak one word about what their hands were touching. Japan built under a roof because of a number it was never able to change. That number was a ratio, and it had been written into international law more than a decade before the first steel plate of the Yamato was ever cut. In the years after the First World War, the great naval powers signed a series of treaties meant to stop exactly the kind of arms race that had helped drag the world into that war. The agreements fixed the size of each nation's battle fleet by ratio. The United States and Britain were allowed the largest navies. Japan was assigned a smaller share, a fleet permanently fixed below the two powers it most expected to fight. For a country that saw the Pacific as its own front yard, that ceiling was intolerable, and in the middle of the 1930s, Japan walked away from the table and let the treaties lapse. Walking away did not fix the underlying problem. Japan could not outbuild the United States. American shipyards were larger, more numerous, and backed by an industrial base many times the size of Japan's own. In a straight contest of how many battleships each side could lay down, Japan would lose, and the men running the Imperial Japanese Navy knew it, so they made a different bet. If they could not win on numbers, they would win on quality. They would build a small number of battleships so large, so heavily armored, and so heavily gunned that no ship the Americans could fit through the Panama Canal would be able to stand against them. One Japanese battleship would be worth 2 or 3 of the enemy's. That entire strategy rested on a single fragile condition. The enemy could not be allowed to know. The moment the United States learned that Japan was building an 18-inch gunned monster, the American response was obvious and unstoppable. They would simply build their own, or build the aircraft and the tactics to sink it. The advantage Japan was gambling everything on existed only for as long as it stayed secret, and so secrecy stopped being a precaution laid on top of the shipbuilding. It became the design requirement that shaped everything else. The Yamato was not a battleship that happened to be built quietly. She was a battleship that had to be invisible, and everything about how she was assembled followed from that. The wall went up around the yards long before the hull took shape. At the Kure Naval Arsenal, where Yamato herself would be built, and at Nagasaki, where her sister ship would rise, the Navy sealed the building slips away from every possible line of sight. Enormous screens and camouflage were stretched over the construction docks. Long walls went up around the yards. Palm trees were planted in deliberate rows to block sight lines from the hills and the water. The windows of nearby houses and buildings, ordinary homes where an ordinary resident might glance out at the harbor, were planked over with wood so that no one inside could see the slipways at all. The people who did the work were locked down as tightly as the ground they worked on. Yard workers were made to sign oaths of secrecy. They passed stringent background checks before they were allowed near the project, and once they were inside, they were forbidden from discussing any part of it with anyone, including their own families. Above them, the machinery of the state did its part. Japan's censors went through the country's newspapers, magazines, and books and scrubbed out references to the ships until the largest warships in the world simply did not exist in any printed word in the nation that was building them. The single most vivid measure of how far this went was made of rope. At Nagasaki, the slipway where the sister ship Musashi was taking shape was screened from view by a vast curtain hung on rope. The amount of rope required to build that curtain reached roughly 2,700 kilometers in total length and weighed around 408 tons. That is not a figure of speech. The Navy consumed so much of this material to hide one ship that it caused a genuine shortage of it on the open market, and local fishermen who needed the same rope for their nets and their boats complained that they could no longer get it. Sit with the scale of that concealment for a moment. To hide a single vessel, the Navy bought enough rope to stretch most of the length of the Japanese home islands, enough that ordinary fishermen felt the loss in their daily work. And it worked. The United States maintained a consulate at Nagasaki, its windows looking out across the very harbor where the second largest battleship on Earth was being assembled in plain view. The American officials inside never saw her. The ship was there, hundreds of feet of steel, and to the enemy watching from across the water, she was not there at all. This was the world the Yamato was born into. Not a normal shipyard with a normal launch schedule, but a sealed chamber where the most heavily armed warship ever conceived would be grown in the dark, one plate at a time, by men who were not permitted to describe what they were making. The screens were up, the oaths were signed, the rope was hung. And behind all of it, in a dry dock at Kure that was about to be torn up and rebuilt to receive her, the machines were already at work. On the 4th of November 1937, workers at the Kure Naval Arsenal laid the keel of the Yamato. The date is worth holding on to because from that morning the yard had a little under 3 years to solve a set of problems that no shipyard on Earth had ever faced at this scale. The first problem was simply the weight of the thing they had agreed to build. Fully loaded, Yamato would displace close to 73,000 tons. She would stretch 263 meters from bow to stern, and her hull would measure almost 39 meters across the beam, wider than any battleship ever built. A hull like that does not sit in an ordinary dock, and it does not float out of one either. The graving dock at Kure, cut into the ground and sealed against the sea, had been built for the warships of an earlier age. It was not deep enough to release the finished Yamato into the water. So before they could build the ship, they rebuilt the dock. The floor of the construction dock was cut deeper, lowered by roughly a meter for the single reason that a hull as heavy as Yamato would sit lower in the water than anything the yard had launched before. And without that extra depth, she would ground on the bottom of her own dock at the moment she was meant to float free. It is a strange thing to picture. Before the first frame of the ship existed, the yard was already digging the ground deeper to make room for how heavy she would one day become. The second problem hung in the air above the dock. Yamato was not just heavy overall. She was armored with steel plate of a thickness that had never been worked before in a Japanese yard, great slabs of it that had to be lifted from the dockside and lowered precisely into position on the growing hull. The cranes that served the dock could not lift that kind of dead weight, so the gantry crane that straddled the construction dock was rebuilt as well, its lifting capacity raised to 100 tons, strong enough to pick up the heaviest armor plates and set them onto the ship without dropping or buckling them. Weigh that number against a human scale. 100 tons is the weight of a locomotive hanging in the air on a hook, swung out over an unfinished warship, again and again, plate after plate, for months on end. The crane was one of the few pieces of the whole operation that could not be hidden behind a screen because it stood taller than the walls. Anyone allowed inside the yard would have seen it moving, which is one more reason almost no one was allowed inside the yard at all. And this is where the machines and the secrecy braided together into one problem. Every solution the engineers found to the challenge of scale made the ship harder to hide. A deeper dock meant more excavation, more spoil hauled away, more activity for a watcher to notice. A taller, stronger crane meant a bigger silhouette against the sky. The heavier the plates, the more rail traffic and barge traffic moved through the yard to deliver them. Building the largest warship in the world generates the largest possible signature, and the men running the project had promised that it would generate none. Their answer was to push the concealment upward as fast as the ship rose. As the hull grew taller in the dock, the screens and the roofing climbed with it. The deeper they dug and the higher the crane reached, the higher the curtains had to hang to keep the whole thing swallowed from view. The hiding was not a fixed wall built once at the start. It was a living skin that grew plate for plate alongside the steel it covered. Inside that skin, the shape of the ship came together with a discipline that bordered on the fanatical. The hull was assembled from steel work to tolerances the yard had never been asked to hold, framed and plated and sealed into the largest single object any of these men had ever touched. And still, from the outside on the hills above Kure and on the water below it, there was almost nothing to see. A tall crane, a wall, some screens, nothing that announced that inside, in a dock that had been dug deeper just to hold her, the heaviest and most heavily armed warship in human history was slowly taking shape. The hull was the foundation, but the hull was never the point. The reason the Yamato existed at all, the reason for the dock and the crane and the wall and the rope, was the weapon she was being built to carry. And that weapon was a secret hidden inside the secret, guarded so carefully that the Navy lied about it in its own paperwork. The guns were the reason for everything. Yamato was designed around 9 main guns, mounted 3 to a turret and 3 great turrets, and each of those guns fired a shell measuring 46 centimeters across, a little over 18 inches. They were the largest naval guns ever fitted to any warship, before or since. No Navy has mounted anything larger on a ship in all the years since, and it was precisely because they were so large that they became the most closely guarded secret of the entire program. The size of a battleship's main guns tells a rival everything. It tells him how far she can shoot, how hard she can hit, and what he would need to build to survive a meeting with her. If the Americans had known that Yamato carried 18-inch guns, they would have understood at once that their own newest battleships, built around 16-inch guns, were outmatched, and they would have answered. So the Japanese Navy did something quietly audacious. In its own official documents, it wrote the guns down as 40-centimeter weapons. On paper, inside the Navy's own paperwork, the guns were recorded as roughly 16 inches, a full 6 centimeters smaller than they actually were. The designation given to them, the Type 94, carried that false 40-centimeter label with it, and it stuck so firmly that the real figure stayed a secret until after the war had ended. Now hold the true scale of these weapons in your mind, because the numbers are difficult to believe even when they are verified. A single one of Yamato's main guns, just the barrel and its breech, weighed about 165 tons. That is one gun. She carried 9 of them, and the guns did not sit on the deck by themselves. Each set of 3 was cradled inside an armored turret assembly, a rotating fortress of steel and machinery, and each of those complete turret assemblies weighed around 2,774 tons. Let that figure land. A single gun turret on the Yamato weighed more than an entire destroyer of the same era. A warship that could sail the ocean under her own power, crewed by hundreds of men, weighed less than one of the 3 turrets bolted into this one battleship. Yamato carried 3 of them, and the shells those guns threw were themselves objects of monstrous weight, each armor-piercing round weighing about 1.5 tons, roughly the weight of a small car, hurled toward a target miles away. Building weapons on this scale created a problem that the Secrecy made worse. The guns and their turret components were manufactured at the naval works, and then they had to be moved to the building yards and lowered into the waiting ships. But an object weighing dozens or hundreds of tons cannot simply be loaded onto a truck, and it cannot be carried by a normal freighter designed for crates and coal. The barbettes and turret parts were too large and too heavy for any conventional cargo ship afloat, and moving them overland was out of the question. So the Navy built a ship to carry them. A single special vessel, the munitions carrier Kashino, was designed and constructed for the sole purpose of transporting the 46-centimeter guns and their turret barbettes between the works and the yards. Her hull was made unusually broad for a ship of her size, widened deliberately so that she could cradle those enormous circular gun mountings inside her. The guns were so big that they required their own dedicated ship, a vessel built from the keel up around the shape of the cargo it would carry, and that cargo was the artillery of a single class of battleship. Everything about this weapon system was oversized, and everything about it was hidden. The true caliber was hidden in the paperwork. The turrets were hidden under the roofs and screens of the yards, and the movement of the guns themselves, which could not be concealed by a wall because it happened out on the open water, was managed by a purpose-built ship that drew as little attention as a vessel carrying the largest guns on Earth possibly could. If you are finding this as remarkable as I do, take a second to subscribe to the channel. We rebuild the forgotten machines and the hidden industrial stories behind the world's most famous ships, one vessel at a time, and there is a great deal more of this story still to come. Because by the time the guns were made and the turrets were ready, the moment had arrived that a normal Navy would have turned into a national celebration. The largest battleship in the world was finished enough to leave her dock. Any other country would have lined the harbor with crowds and photographers to watch her take the water for the first time. Japan had built a ship that officially did not exist, carrying guns that were officially smaller than they were. There would be no crowds. The launch of the Yamato was going to be one more thing that nobody was allowed to see. On the 8th of August 1940, the Yamato was floated out of her dock at Kure. 2 years and 9 months after her keel was laid, the largest warship ever built met the water for the first time. A launch is normally the proudest day in the life of a shipyard. It is the day the public is invited in, the day the bands play and the crowds gather and the newspapers send their photographers, because a ship going into the water for the first time is a spectacle that a nation wants to see and a builder once remembered. For the Yamato, there was none of that. She was moved into the water inside the same sealed world in which she had been built, without the crowds, without the fanfare, without the public celebration that a ship of her size would have commanded anywhere else on Earth. The most significant warship launch of the century happened, in effect, in silence. Just how far the Navy was willing to go to keep these launches hidden is best seen at Nagasaki, where the sister ship was floated out around the same period. To launch a battleship, you cannot keep every worker sealed behind a wall. The event spills outward. There is movement in the harbor, there is noise, there is the sheer visible fact of an enormous hull sliding into the water where anyone on the shore might see it. So the Navy manufactured a reason for the whole city to stay indoors and look away. On the day of the sister ship's launch, the authorities staged a citywide air raid drill, sending the residents of Nagasaki off the streets and into cover, keeping them away from the waterfront at the exact moment the second largest ship in the world took to the water. The population was made to hide from an attack that was not coming so that they could not watch the launch that was. Once Yamato was in the water, the work was far from finished. A floated hull is not a warship. She still had to be fitted out, the long and intricate process of turning a sealed steel hull into a living fighting ship, with her engines and boilers married into her guns and turrets installed, her fire control systems, her armor, her miles of wiring and piping all brought together. This was done at the fitting out berth, still under the same regime of screens and secrecy that had covered the dock month after month through 1940 and into 1941. And then, on the 16th of December 1941, the Yamato was formally commissioned into the Imperial Japanese Navy. The timing is worth pausing on. Just over a week earlier, Japanese aircraft had struck the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, and the Pacific War the Yamato had been conceived to fight was now real. The ship that had been built in total secrecy to defeat the United States Navy entered service in the same week that Japan attacked it. Even now, at the moment she officially became a warship of the fleet, there was no grand unveiling. Her commissioning was kept deliberately austere, a ceremony stripped of the usual fanfare that would mark a lesser ship entering service, let alone the mightiest battleship ever constructed. There was no announcement to the world, no proud photograph in the papers, no boast about the 18-inch guns or the record tonnage. The Navy had spent 4 years making the Yamato invisible, and it was not about to undo that work with a celebration on the day she was finished. She simply, quietly joined the fleet. Weigh the full achievement of what the yards had done by that December. In a little over 4 years, inside a sealed and screened enclosure, they had built and commissioned a ship displacing nearly 73,000 tons, armed with guns whose true caliber was written down as a lie, and they had carried her through every public milestone of her creation, the keel laying, the launch, the commissioning, without letting the outside world see or understand what she truly was. The largest and most powerful battleship in the history of the world had come into being, and to the enemies she had been built to fight, she remained a rumor with the wrong numbers attached to it. But secrecy on this scale is not free, and it is not only measured in rope and screens and false paperwork, it was paid for by people. Thousands of them. The men who actually built the Yamato spent years of their lives assembling the largest machine any of them would ever touch, and they did it under a burden that the fitting out and the launch schedules never record. To understand the real cost of building a ship in total secrecy, you have to look at the men who were not allowed to know what they were building. The men who built the Yamato were not told what they were building. That was the deepest layer of the secrecy, and in some ways the cruelest. Knowledge of the project was broken into pieces and handed out in fragments, so that a worker labored on his own small part of the ship without being permitted to understand the whole. A man might spend months fitting a section of the hull, or wiring a compartment, or working on a single mechanism, and never be allowed to stand back and see the complete thing his hands were helping to raise. He had signed an oath. He had passed the background checks, and he had been folded into a system deliberately designed so that no ordinary worker held enough of the picture to give it away, even by accident, even to his own family at his own dinner table. Try to imagine the strangeness of that daily life. You go to work behind a wall you are not allowed to describe. You build something enormous that you are not allowed to name. You cannot tell your wife what you did today, cannot tell your children what you make, cannot say a word to a neighbor about the largest and most secret object in the country, which you are helping to construct with your own hands. Thousands of men lived inside that silence for years. The rope and the screens and the false paperwork are the details that survive in the record. But the real machinery of the secret was human. It was carried in the minds of ordinary workers who were made to hold their tongues day after day for as long as the ship took to build. And here is where the whole story turns back on itself. The secrecy worked. That is the remarkable and terrible fact at the center of all of this. Every layer of it, the deepened dock hidden behind screens, the guns disguised in the paperwork, the launches masked and the commissioning stripped of ceremony, the oath-bound workers who never saw the whole ship, all of it held. The proof is exactly where this story began. In July of 1945, the United States Office of Naval Intelligence still recorded the Yamato class as carrying 16-inch guns. 4 full years of construction and years more of war after that, and the enemy still had the single most important measurement wrong. By the standard the Japanese Navy had set for itself in the 1930s, this was a total success. The secret had been kept, and it bought them almost nothing. By the time American intelligence was still getting her guns wrong in the summer of 1945, the Yamato was already gone. She had been sunk that April, caught in the East China Sea and torn apart by wave after wave of American carrier aircraft, going down with roughly 3,000 of her crew. She had been built to fight enemy battleships in a great gunnery duel, the kind of clash the world's navies had spent decades preparing for. That duel never came. The war at sea had been decided instead by the aircraft carrier and the airplane, by weapons launched from over the horizon that never came within reach of her 18-inch guns. The mightiest big gun battleship ever built was sunk by the very kind of weapon that had made big gun battleships obsolete. So look again at what the secrecy actually achieved. It hid a weapon so well that the enemy never learned its true nature, and it hid it for so long that by the time the truth might have mattered, the weapon itself was already at the bottom of the sea, and the age it was built for was already over. The most perfectly concealed warship in history was, in the end, concealing a ship that the war had passed by. All that rope, all those screens, all those years of silence carried by all those workers, and the thing they were protecting had been rendered out of date almost before it was finished. There is no triumph in that ending, and there should not be. But there is something worth holding on to in the machines and the men themselves, separate from the strategy that drove them. The dock dug deeper into the earth to receive a hull no yard had ever floated. The crane rebuilt to lift 100 tons of armor plate at a stroke. The guns so large they needed a ship of their own to carry them. And the thousands of ordinary workers who built the largest thing any of them would ever touch, in silence, under oath, never seeing the whole of what they made. The Yamato was the product of an obsession that the war proved wrong. She was also one of the most extraordinary feats of industrial construction the 20th century ever produced, and the fact that it was done entirely in the dark makes it more astonishing, not less. The machines that built her and the machinery that hid her were one and the same. That was true from the first meter dug out of the dock to the last false number written in the file. And in the story of the world's great ships, there has never been another quite like the one that was built where no one was allowed to look. The next Leviathan we take apart was hidden from no one. It was cheered by millions, and it killed men by the hundreds in the open in front of the world. That story is one click away.